It happened at Thanksgiving in the middle of the clatter of forks and the hum of family chatter. Grandpa, usually reserved, lifted his voice just enough to say, "When I go back to my apartment." Silence fell in my mind. He didn't live in an apartment, or at least none of us believed he did. That single word split the room inside me a crack wide enough to swallow certainty. What secret had he been holding all this time? Before we dive deeper into this story, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments, and while you're here, remember to press like and hit subscribe so you won't miss the rest of this unfolding secret. Share this video if you've ever discovered something unexpected about a loved one. Now let's step into the next part, where family dynamics unravel quietly beneath the surface. I grew up watching the rhythm of our family gatherings, as if I were standing behind glass, close enough to hear every word, but never quite able to step inside. At Thanksgiving, Christmas, even birthdays, I slipped naturally into the role of the helper. I refilled water glasses, carried trays of food, stacked plates, and made sure the trash was taken out before it overflowed. My cousins laughed loudly at the table, boasting about their new jobs, their vacations, the bonuses that arrived like gifts from the sky. My brother leaned back in his chair, confident in his own importance, speaking over people instead of to them. My parents fussed over the grandkids, their attention scattered in all directions, but mine. By the time dessert appeared, I often felt like a ghost, moving between rooms, useful but invisible. Grandpa was the only one who seemed to notice. He watched me with steady eyes, never loud, never demanding, but always there. When I placed a slice of pie before him, he didn't rush to eat it. He looked at me first, as though he saw not just the plate, but the person who carried it. He would say, "You've been working hard," in a tone that carried no judgment, just recognition. That recognition meant more than I could admit. The night he mentioned the word apartment, it reminded me of all the small slips I had brushed aside before. Once I heard him on the phone, his voice softer than usual, carrying a note of privacy I couldn't place. Another time, he returned from what was supposed to be a simple walk with his satchel heavier than before, tucking it quickly into the corner of his room. No one asked, no one cared, except me, and now I couldn't ignore it. Sitting at the crowded table, I stared at the untouched slice of pumpkin pie near the end of the counter. It had been cut for someone, but no one reached for it. Its surface grew dull as minutes stretched on cream, settling into faint lines. That pie, sitting there unclaimed, mirrored something I felt deep inside, waiting, unnoticed, slowly fading. I carried that image with me long after the dishes were washed and the laughter had quieted. I wondered if Grandpa carried something similar, some hidden part of his life he couldn't share with the rest. I thought about how much of him remained in silence, tucked behind polite nods and measured sentences. Maybe his word apartment was a slip, or maybe it was a door he had cracked open for me to see. After that night, the word apartment refused to leave me alone. It clung to the edges of my thoughts as stubbornly as the scent of cinnamon that lingered in my kitchen after baking. I folded laundry the next morning, my hands moving on autopilot, but my mind wandered back to Grandpa's slip. I could still hear the deliberate way he said it, not rushed, not jumbled, as though it had always been part of his vocabulary, just hidden from the rest of us. Why now? Why at that moment? I thought of the times he'd lowered his voice when answering the phone, a hand cupped around the receiver, his words reduced to a hush. I remembered the weight of his worn leather satchel, always by his side, always locked with a small brass clasp. It traveled with him from room to room like an extension of himself. None of us dared to touch it. None of us even asked what he kept inside. I used to imagine it was just bills or old photographs, but now my imagination ran wild. Could it hold a set of keys? Could it carry proof of this mysterious apartment he had let slip into the air? I felt guilty for letting suspicion grow, but the thought of secrets gnawed at me. Why would he keep something so large, an entire apartment, separate from his family? Was it protection, or was it betrayal? My kitchen hummed with the ordinary. The refrigerator clicked on the clock above the stove, ticked steadily. Yet I felt suspended, like I was listening for something that wasn't there. I carried a basket of folded towels down the hallway, each step echoing against my unease. I had spent years letting the world move past me, telling myself I didn't need to know everything, but this was different. This felt like an invitation, though unspoken. I imagined the satchel again, its surface cracked from years of use, the brass clasp catching the light. I could picture him gripping it when he walked his hand tight, as though daring the world to pry. Why did I never ask? Why did I always assume his silences were walls instead of doors? The thought left me unsettled. I couldn't just sit still anymore. I told myself I was only going to see him to bring groceries, to do what I always did. But beneath that excuse was a current pulling me toward the truth. When I stepped into his home, the familiar smell of coffee grounds and polished wood wrapped around me. Everything looked the same at first glance: the tidy shelves, the framed photos, the clock that ticked with its steady rhythm. Yet my eyes searched for inconsistencies, details I had missed before. I placed the bag of groceries on the counter and noticed his keyring hanging on a small hook by the door. There were more keys than I remembered, not just the obvious ones for his house and car. One had a square head etched with numbers I didn't recognize, its metal worn smooth from frequent use. Another was smaller, almost delicate, the kind that might fit a mailbox or storage locker. My gaze lingered too long. He cleared his throat behind me, and I forced myself to smile, unpacking apples as if I hadn't seen anything. When he left the room to fetch his glasses, I noticed receipts on the table, crumpled, yet revealing. They were from a grocery store across town, in a neighborhood I had never known him to visit. My chest tightened. Why shop so far when the local market was just blocks away? I slipped the receipts back into place before he returned, but the questions pressed harder against my ribs. I tried to steer the conversation, gently testing the waters. "Grandpa," I said, keeping my voice casual, "the other night you mentioned your apartment." He froze just for a breath, then adjusted his glasses and said, "I must have misspoken." His tone was final, his eyes on the newspaper now, but I could feel the wall he had just built between us. I nodded, pretending to accept it, though the silence that followed rang louder than words. I left his house with my mind buzzing, the image of those keys burned into memory, the receipts folded into the corners of my thoughts. The slip of the tongue hadn't been an accident. I knew it now. He was protecting something, and I couldn't yet tell whether it was for himself or for all of us. That uncertainty gnawed at me as I drove home, headlights cutting through the dark. I gripped the steering wheel harder than usual, knowing I was too deep to step back. This was no longer curiosity. It was a need, a responsibility, something I had to uncover. Even if the answers frightened me, the pull toward the truth became stronger than my hesitation. And one gray afternoon, I found myself driving across town, following the quiet trail of clues that had rooted themselves in my mind. The streets grew less familiar the farther I went, rows of brick buildings replacing the tidy suburban lawns I had always known. A faded laundromat stood beside a bakery with peeling paint on its sign, the sidewalks cracked and uneven, littered with last autumn's leaves that had never been swept away. My heart thudded harder as I slowed in front of a building whose facade looked tired but steady, with mailboxes lined in a neat row just inside the glass doors. There it was, his name, bold, unmistakable, printed on one of the slots. I sat in my car longer than I should have, staring at those letters until they blurred. He really did have an apartment. This wasn't imagination, wasn't some misunderstanding. It was fact carved into the metal of that mailbox. Fear and exhilaration wrestled inside me. I stepped out of the car, the air biting against my skin, and walked slowly toward the entrance. The chipped paint on the door told me it had been opened countless times, each one leading to lives hidden behind closed walls. I placed my hand on the handle, but didn't pull. Just beyond this threshold lay answers, but also questions I might not be ready to face. My fingers lingered on the cold metal, torn between stepping forward and turning back. As I hesitated, the door swung open from the inside. A man about my age stepped out, his face vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place from where. He brushed past me without a glance, carrying a paper bag of groceries, his steps quick, as if he had somewhere important to be. My pulse quickened. Who was he, and why did he seem like a ghost from the edges of memory? I backed away, letting the door close, the echo of its latch sharp in my ears. I couldn't go in. Not yet. But the sight of Grandpa's name on that mailbox, the feel of the threshold under my hand, had already changed everything. The secret was real, and it waited just a few steps beyond the door. The night after standing at that chipped door, I couldn't sleep. My room was filled with shadows, the ticking of the clock louder than my breath each second, stretching like a rope pulled too tight. I kept replaying the image of his name carved into the mailbox slot. How tangible it was, how undeniable. I told myself I would respect his privacy, that it wasn't my place to pry. But the promise dissolved the moment I remembered the satchel he never let go of. That leather bag, scuffed at the corners, had to be more than a carrier of bills. The next morning, with a determination I didn't recognize in myself, I drove back to his house under the excuse of bringing him soup. He welcomed me with a tired smile, never suspecting the storm inside me. While he shuffled into the kitchen to fetch spoons, my eyes fell again on the satchel resting near his chair. My hands itched to reach for it. The brass clasp gleamed faintly in the sunlight streaming through the window. I leaned down and touched it almost reverently, the leather soft under my fingertips. For a breath, I felt like a thief in my own family, but then my fingers brushed against something firm, tucked in a side pocket. It was small, metallic, unmistakably a key. My heart thudded so loudly, I thought he might hear it from the kitchen. Before he returned, I slid my hand back, forcing myself into stillness. I didn't take the key that day, but I had memorized its weight, its presence, its invitation. 2 nights later, when I was alone, I drove back to the apartment building with a determination that startled me. My palms were damp against the steering wheel, my breath shallow. I parked under the glow of a flickering streetlight and held the duplicate key I had secretly made after borrowing the original while Grandpa napped. Shame clawed at me, but curiosity was stronger. I approached the door, slid the key into the lock, and turned. The heavy door yielded with a click, swinging open into a hushed hallway. The building smelled of dust, old varnish, and faint traces of cooking oil that had seeped into the walls over decades. The carpet under my shoes was worn, its pattern faded, threadbare in places. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, until I reached the number matching Grandpa's name. For a moment, I stood frozen before it. My hand trembled as I slid the key into the lock and twisted. The door swung inward on stiff hinges, releasing a wave of still air that smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. I stepped inside, and the world I thought I knew collapsed. The apartment was modest, but alive with memory. On one wall hung photographs, dozens of them framed, and unframed, spanning decades. At first, my breath caught at the familiar face of my grandmother, younger than I had ever known her. Her smile radiant, her hair loose around her shoulders. Next to her were images I didn't recognize, strangers standing in front of old cars, gatherings in backyards, children with faces blurred by time. But it wasn't just the photographs. The living room was arranged as if she still lived there. A small table stood in the corner, 2 teacups resting on lace doilies, as if waiting for hands that would never return. A vase of silk flowers sat in the center, their petals dusted but still bright. A blanket, the kind she used to knit in long stretches of silence, was folded neatly on the arm of the sofa. My legs weakened. I lowered myself into a chair, the fabric cool beneath me. This wasn't just an apartment. It was a shrine. Every surface whispered of devotion, of grief that had never been allowed to fade. I rose, slowly drawn down a narrow hallway to a bedroom door slightly ajar. When I pushed it open, I nearly wept. The room was untouched, a perfect echo of her presence. A floral quilt covered the bed, and a perfume bottle sat uncapped on the vanity, its scent faint but unmistakable. Her closet door was open just enough to reveal dresses, shoes lined neatly, a scarf hanging as if ready for her shoulders. Time had stopped here. My throat tightened. I pressed my fingers to my lips, holding back a sob. Had he been coming here all these years, keeping her alive in the way the rest of us had failed to? I felt both awe and guilt, ashamed that I had moved on too quickly after her death, leaving him to grieve alone. On the desk near the window were journals stacked neatly, each bound in worn leather. I opened one, its pages filled with handwriting I recognized as his. Lines and lines of his private thoughts stretched before me. I see her in every room, one entry read. The silence at home is too much. Here I can still breathe. Tears blurred my vision as I read further. He wrote of family dinners where no one mentioned her name, of feeling invisible in his mourning, of finding solace in this hidden place. But as I turned to later pages, I found something unexpected. My own name. Over and over in different entries, he wrote of me. She notices the things no one else does. She carries her silence the way I carry mine. Another entry. If anyone understands what it feels like to be overlooked, it is her. One day, this space will belong to her, not as a burden, but as a refuge. I pressed my palm flat against the paper, as though I could touch his heart through the ink. I felt dizzy, my breath ragged. He hadn't hidden this apartment out of betrayal. He had hidden it out of love, out of loyalty to the woman he lost, and perhaps out of faith in me. I sank to the floor, the journals spread around me, the photographs watching from the walls. My whole life, I had felt invisible at family gatherings, fading into the background. But here, in this sacred space, I was anything but invisible. He had seen me all along. My chest swelled with emotions too tangled to name: grief, gratitude, sorrow, wonder. As I rose, I placed the journals back carefully, my hands shaking. I lingered in the room one last time, letting the scent of lavender and cedar settle into me. This secret was heavier than I could carry alone, yet it was also the first time I felt chosen and trusted. When I closed the apartment door behind me, I paused in the hallway, pressing my forehead to the cool wood. My heart ached, but for the first time in years, it ached with meaning. The secret was no longer just his. It was mine too, and it had changed me forever. I drove home from the apartment in a fog, the city lights blurring into streaks on the windshield, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I couldn't decide whether to feel guilty for trespassing or grateful for what I had discovered. The journals burned in my mind, his words echoing with a truth I had never known I wasn't invisible to him. I was the one he trusted. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing what I might say, how I could possibly ask him why he had carried this secret for so long. The thought of confrontation filled me with dread, but silence felt unbearable now that I knew. A few days later, I found myself at his house again. The sun had set early, and the living room was bathed in the low glow of a single lamp. He sat in his worn armchair, glasses perched on the edge of his nose, a newspaper open but unread. I carried a quiet resolve as I sat opposite him. For a while, neither of us spoke, only the ticking clock filling the space between us. Finally, I drew in a breath. "Grandpa?" I said softly. I went to the apartment. His eyes lifted slowly, meeting mine, and I saw no anger there, only a deep sadness, as if he had expected this moment. He folded his newspaper carefully, setting it aside, and adjusted his glasses with trembling hands. "I wondered when you'd find it," he murmured. His voice was steady, but laced with the weight of years. I leaned forward, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why keep it a secret all this time?" He sighed, his chest rising and falling, as though the question pressed heavily against his ribs. "Because after she died, everyone else moved on so quickly. Your parents? Your uncles? They boxed up her clothes, packed away her photos. They said it was time to heal, time to live again. But for me, time stopped. I couldn't let go, not then, not now. That apartment, it was the only place where she still felt alive. I kept her there in every photograph, every piece of fabric, every quiet corner." His words fell like stones into the silence. My throat ached as I tried to respond, but he continued, his gaze fixed on the lamp's glow. "I didn't tell them because they would have laughed, or worse, pitied me. But you see things others don't. You've always carried yourself like someone who knows what it means to be unseen. I didn't want to burden you, but I wanted you to know one day. That's why I wrote your name in my journals, why I left the apartment in your name." I swallowed hard, my vision blurring with tears. "You thought of me?" I whispered, barely audible. He looked at me, then his eyes shimmering with a softness I had rarely seen. "You were never invisible to me. I saw how they overlooked you at dinners, how they drowned you out. But you're the one who paid attention. You're the one who listened in silence. That's why I trust you with her memory. Because I know you won't let it fade." My chest cracked open with a rush of grief and gratitude, my tears spilling freely now. For years, I had believed I was the forgotten one, the shadow at the edge of the family. And yet here was proof spoken in his trembling voice that I had been chosen, that my quiet watchfulness had meant something all along. The room felt sacred, the lamp casting a circle of golden light around us, as if we were sealed in our own world. I reached across the space between us and took his hand, the skin thin and cool, but his grip steady. "Thank you," I said, my voice breaking, "for trusting me, for seeing me." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "She would have wanted it this way," he said. "She always said you had her eyes, her way of noticing the small things. That's why I knew you'd understand." We sat there, hand in hand, the clock ticking softly, the house holding its breath around us. The day I finally spoke to Grandpa about what I had seen began quietly with the kind of soft morning light that makes everything appear gentler than it really is. I drove to his house with a knot in my chest, clutching one of his journals I had borrowed without asking. My guilt pressed against me the whole way, but stronger still was the need to let him know I understood. When I arrived, He was sitting by the window in his favorite chair, the satchel resting faithfully at his side. The air smelled faintly of coffee and furniture polish. He looked up, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly at the sight of the journal in my hands. I sat down across from him, placing the worn book carefully on the table between us. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The clock ticked on the wall, a metronome for our silence. Finally, I whispered, "I found it, Grandpa. The apartment." His shoulders sagged as if the weight he had been carrying had finally been named. He didn't scold me. He didn't even look surprised. Instead, he rubbed his temples slowly, breathing out a long, tired sigh. "I wondered if you would," he said quietly. His voice trembled with something I couldn't place. Fear maybe, but also relief. I leaned forward, my throat tight. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you tell me?" His gaze dropped to the satchel. He traced the brass clasp with his fingertip, then looked back up at me. His eyes were glassy, rimmed with years of unspoken grief. "Because no one wanted to remember her anymore. After your grandmother passed, they packed away her things, stopped saying her name, moved forward as if grief had an expiration date. I wouldn't. That apartment was the only place I could keep her alive." His words broke something inside me. I thought back to the preserved bedroom, the teacups waiting, the journals filled with his private mourning. My hands trembled. "But why me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why write about me? Why leave it for me?" He closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them steady and piercing. "Because you were the only one who saw me. You think I didn't notice? Every holiday you stood in the kitchen unnoticed, cleaning up after everyone. They spoke over you, ignored you, but you saw me. You noticed when my hands shook pouring coffee, when I folded a napkin too many times to distract myself. You never said it, but you carried the same silence I did. That's why I knew you'd understand." Tears burned behind my eyes, spilling before I could stop them. For years I had felt invisible, but here in this fragile confession, I was suddenly luminous. He had chosen me not for duty, not for obligation, but for kinship, for the unspoken bond of two people who carried grief like a second skin. I wiped my cheeks clumsily, unable to stop the sob rising in my chest. "I thought I was forgotten," I whispered. "I thought I didn't matter." He leaned forward, his voice fierce, though quiet. "You were never forgotten. You mattered to me more than anyone knew. That apartment, it isn't just hers, it's ours now. It's the place where the overlooked can still exist." His hand trembled as he reached across the table. I placed mine in his, the warmth of his grip anchoring me to the moment. I had always thought his silences were walls, but now I understood they were bridges waiting for me to cross. The lamp beside us cast a low glow, softening the lines of his face, making him look both older and stronger than I had ever seen. The world outside went on as usual, cars passing, children shouting in the street, but inside that small room, everything shifted. We spoke for hours, not of mundane details, but of the past, of Grandma's laugh, of the nights he spent alone writing in those journals. He told me how the family's indifference had carved him hollow, how the apartment had become a refuge where he could still speak her name aloud without shame. He confessed how each object in that space had meaning. The silk flowers were the last ones she bought before falling ill. The blanket on the sofa was her unfinished project. The perfume bottle on the vanity was hers untouched since the day she left. Every detail became a story, and every story stitched me closer to him. At one point, he grew quiet, staring into his lap. "I know I should have told you sooner," he said, "but I was afraid. Afraid they would take it from me, dismiss it as foolish. Afraid they would laugh at an old man clinging to ghosts. But with you, I never feared that. You carry silence differently. You don't mock it. You honor it." His words carved deep into me, reshaping the way I saw myself. My silence, which I had long considered a flaw, was suddenly a strength, a gift. I realized that in all my years of being invisible, I had been seen in the only place that mattered in his eyes. By the time the lamp flickered and the evening settled in, I felt a strange peace I hadn't known before. We sat there, our hands still joined, as if bridging decades of loneliness. I thought of the untouched pumpkin pie at Thanksgiving, the way it sat waiting overlooked. Now I understood I had been that pie, and so had he. But in his apartment, nothing was left untouched. Everything was remembered, honored, preserved. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt chosen. As I rose to leave that night, he handed me the key without hesitation. His hand shook as he pressed it into my palm. "It's yours now, too," he said. "Take care of it. Take care of her memory. And when the time comes, take care of your own." I nodded, unable to speak through the thickness of my throat. The key felt heavy in my hand, heavier than metal, had any right to be, as if it carried all the years of silence and love bound inside that hidden space. I walked out into the night, the cool air filling my lungs, the stars sharp above me. The world hadn't changed, not on the surface, but within me everything had shifted. I was no longer the forgotten one. I was the keeper of memory, the bearer of truth, the one entrusted to hold what others had cast aside. And that knowledge lit something inside me brighter than any spotlight ever could.